The pyramids. The enigmatic Sphinx. Karnak and Luxor, temples, statues, mummies, tombs that re-emerge from the desert, from the proverbial sands of time. All of them revealing one of the most amazing and fascinating civilizations man has ever lived through. Egypt of the Pharaohs, a civilization that was born and thrived 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. When most of the world was still inhabited by Stone Age cave dwellers, the Egyptians could read and write. They could make cotton thread and weave cloth for their elaborate garments, work precious metals like gold into fine ornaments. They were convinced there was an afterlife. They had doctors to treat the sick and men of learning who studied the stars. In short, there was an elaborate, sophisticated culture thriving in the Nile Basin 5,000 years ago. A culture that was to give the world many of the fundamentals of art and science. This, the oldest civilization of the Mediterranean, grew like most other civilizations around a great river, the Nile, the life force of Egypt. In the year 3000 BC, the country was divided into two vast kingdoms. Lower Egypt had Horus, the falcon god, to protect it. Upper Egypt had Seth, the sacred dog. King Menes conquered Lower Egypt and united the country, becoming the supreme and absolute ruler. These kings were later called pharaohs, which meant great house or royal palace. Kings, yet at the same time, living gods. In this journey, we shall see ancient Egypt come alive again. The pyramids of Giza will appear as they did when they were first built. We will go into the great temple of Luxor. But this will not be a journey into the past just to admire these gigantic monuments as they once were. We will also be seeing how the Egyptians lived in ancient times, how they dressed, the food they ate, the way they worked, and how they entertained themselves. A cultured, active people, curious about the mysteries of life and death, who have left us a rich, colorful, and exciting chapter of ancient history, created by men and by gods. Perhaps never before in the history of humanity had any man been as powerful as an Egyptian pharaoh. More than the Roman emperors, more than the kings of Persepolis and Babylon. The pharaohs ruled with absolute power, a people who worshipped them as direct descendants of the sun god. They were considered immortal and able to command even the forces of nature, challenging the centuries and time itself. But before Egypt and her people existed, there was the Nile. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Egypt is a gift of the Nile, and no river was ever so generous. From the time of the pharaohs up to the construction of the Aswan Dam, The Nile was swollen during the summer season by the equatorial rains coming from its sources and flooded the surrounding land, enriching it with lime, a mud formed of rotted foliage and wood from the Central African forests, which made an excellent fertilizer for crops, turning the desert into a lush green paradise for abundant cultivation. Egypt of the pharaohs. All the peasant farmers had to do was to wait until the floodwaters subsided, then spread the residue over the land, plow and sow, and wait for the harvest. Even the clay on her banks provided the population with a variety of useful things, like bricks for building, tiles, and pottery. Around 2,700 years BC, during the Third Dynasty, all the factors necessary for the construction of the greatest buildings man had ever attempted were set in place. Prosperity, a vast workforce, and an efficient system of transport on waterways permitted the construction of the pyramids of Giza, the great tombs of Cheops, Khephren, and Mykerinos. Giza is a small suburb on the outskirts of Cairo. Life there is quiet and unhurried. The Muezzin reminds everyone from his lofty perch that Allah's eyes don't miss a thing. You have only to look up to realize that Giza is no ordinary place, for it is dominated by the Great Pyramids. The most extraordinary funeral monument ever conjured in the mind of a human being. An Egyptian proverb tells us, man fears time, but time fears the pyramids. On this high plain at the edge of the desert, between 2,723 and 2,563 BC, Egypt's grandeur literally reached its apex. These are the most imposing of the 90 or so pyramids, and the greatest is the tomb of the pharaoh Cheops, judged by Philo of Byzantium to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one to survive to modern times. These extraordinary constructions were the result of amazing engineering skill. Even today, with all the know-how of modern technology at our fingertips, they would be extremely difficult to copy. The perfection of their dimensions, the result of a profound understanding of geometry, has rarely been duplicated in architecture in all the periods of history that followed. The world had to wait until the construction of the Eiffel Tower for the Paris exhibition of 1889 before their height was exceeded. It may seem incredible, but once this was a green and fertile bit of land. There were no desert sands here, and not a sign of speculators' building sites either. Trees and shrubbery flourished along the banks of irrigation canals that joined the area to the Nile. The pyramids were originally faced with a smooth limestone surface that glistened like polished marble. In the 1st century AD, Roman historian Plinius described how people would slide down them for fun. This surface has worn off over the centuries, so that now all we can see are the giant stone steps that lay beneath. Only the top of the pyramid of Khephren has retained part of the original smooth surface, showing us how they must have looked all over. If we consider what means the Egyptians had at their disposal, compared to those we possess today, it staggers the mind. They had no cranes, no pulleys or winches, nothing mechanical to lift the great blocks, except manpower. The Egyptians had not yet discovered the wheel, and the cart would not be imported from Asia until 1,000 years after it was needed here. It was entirely built with the strength of human muscle, the physical effort of thousands upon thousands of men. The granite blocks from Aswan, weighing up to 70 tons each, were brought 500 miles to the Valley of the Pyramids, where there was a navigable canal on which huge rafts of bound papyrus cane carried them to the men who would mount them one on top of another. in the precise positions they would remain in forever. According to the historian Herodotus, more than 100,000 men worked for 10 years to build the raised road to the spot where the Pyramid of Cheops was built. The workforce was not entirely made up of slaves. Most of them were workmen paid by the state. They had a regular salary and were provided with food, clothing, and lodging. Work was organized in military fashion, with units consisting of 1,000 men each. A squad called the White Crown of Khufu the Powerful worked on the Pyramid of Cheops. The Pyramid of the Pharaoh Cheops was the first to be built, around 2,600 years before Christ. Its base covers 12.5 acres, and each side measures 750 feet, more than 7 blocks of a city like New York. This base was leveled so precisely that at no point on the surface was it more than 1.5 inches out of line. It was 450 feet high, the height of a modern 40-story skyscraper. It has been estimated that 2,300,000 stone blocks were required to build it, weighing between 2 and 15 tons each. Yet all this grandeur was evidently not appreciated by contemporaries of Cheops, whose lives were not made easy by its construction. His enemies spread the rumor that their pharaoh had sold his own daughter to raise the necessary funds for the building of his mausoleum. Probably an exaggeration. What is certain is that Cheops must have had to invent ways of raising money. The amount of cash necessary to pay the enormous numbers of workers employed on the project was overwhelming. More than 1 million people worked 6 months of the year for 23 years throughout the entire reign of Cheops, from 2551 to 2528 BC. The Pyramid of Cheops, that of his son Khephren, just a few feet lower, but rising from a base that makes it seem higher. And the Pyramid of Mykerinos, Khepren's brother and heir, which was only 275 feet high. They were not only tombs, but tangible monuments to the cult of death, a cult that was profoundly rooted in the Egyptian spirit at all levels of the population. The result was awesome. The eyes of man had never beheld any constructions so huge. There may even have been a small lake in front of the Sphinx. Here on the east side of the pyramids, as you can see today, there's a modern highway laden with heavy traffic. But 4,500 years ago, it was a glorious sight to behold in the desert sunshine. What was this pyramid like inside? The present way into it is like a gaping hole in its side. The stone was hacked into in the 9th century AD by Caliph el-Mamun's men, who were anxious to get their hands on the royal treasures they believed lay within. The Arabian Nights describes the interior of the pyramid in rich detail. Inside the Western Pyramid, there are 30 rooms of colored granite, filled with precious gems, unimaginable quantities of coins, instruments, and magnificent weapons, smeared with miraculous ointments to prevent them ever rusting. One is filled with emotion after climbing breathlessly up to the funeral chamber of Cheops. There is only the austere sarcophagus of granite, empty and damaged, with no lid. Many centuries ago, unknown intruders discovered it and removed everything of value, including the king's mummified body. The Egyptians believed in a life after death, for which the body was as important as the spirit. This was why the pharaohs, nobles, and humble citizens went to great trouble to have themselves preserved when they died. It has been calculated that during the reigns of the pharaohs, more than 500 million people lived on Egyptian soil, and most of them were mummified after death. Like the funeral business of today, mummifying came in several price ranges: luxury, moderate, and economical. The process took up to 70 days for the higher echelons of society, during which the internal organs were removed and the corpse dehydrated. Next came the embalming process to make the skin durable like leather. In order to keep its shape, the body was generally filled with clay and sawdust and then bound up in thousands of feet of muslin bandages and laid to rest in a carved wooden sarcophagus. As an example, the mummy of Ramses II, the great warrior pharaoh, who erected more statues and monuments than any other Egyptian king. Not only were humans mummified, also many animals, often regarded as sacred, especially beloved household pets like cats. But back to Giza, to the Sphinx, the monument that has fired the imagination of people over the ages more than any other. The Sphinx is the largest freestanding sculpture surviving from the ancient world. It is an enormous statue of a recumbent lion with a human head, probably the face of the pharaoh Khephren, staring towards the east, guarding the sacred plateau. Sculpted from an outcrop of living rock, its proportions are colossal. 65 feet high and 240 feet long. Its nose alone measured almost 8 feet. The face has been damaged many times by the forces of nature, wind in particular, by the guns of the Turkish Mamelukes, as well as the cannons of various armies, including Napoleon's artillery. Sandstorms have eroded the statue, and now pollution is taking its toll. Frequently restored over the years, it is considered one of the world's great historical monuments most at risk. Let's see how it looked when it was new 4,500 years ago, with all its missing parts restored and in the full splendor of its original color. It carried the Nemes, the royal headdress with the sacred serpent, all painted in bright colors. The face red, the beard indigo, the headdress blue. The motive for the construction of so vast a monument remains a mystery, but it seems almost certain it was conceived as a sentinel watching over the tombs of the pharaohs, the great pyramids of Giza. Let's move to another part of the Nile Valley, to Saqqara, about 15 miles from Giza. The oldest Egyptian pyramid is this, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, built by the pharaoh Zoser. Today, only the blazing desert separates Saqqara from Giza, but long ago this was an immense necropolis where people from every strata of society were buried, including the kings of the city of Memphis, capital of the ancient kingdom. Built around 2650 BC, it contains a maze of underground passages, far more than any of the other pyramids. It is the oldest example of a monumental building. The man who designed it was Imhotep, Zoser's chancellor, who later would be deified, the first architect whose name appears in history. The pyramid is built in steps, a development of an original mastaba tomb design, and perhaps symbolizes a stairway to paradise. An effigy of the pharaoh was kept in the Serdab, a sealed room pierced by only 2 small observation holes, through which he could see out. The original in a dark limestone is in the Cairo Museum. The damage to the face results from the work of thieves who gouged out the precious stones set in the eye sockets. A great wall surrounded the Step Pyramid, about half a mile long, 45 feet high, with a series of 13 false stone doors. There was only one real entrance on the southeastern side. Here's what the grandiose compound of Xhosa's funeral complex looked like in all its original imposing glory. It was built to last, and last it certainly did. It is the earliest surviving construction in stone. On entering, we are confronted with 40 giant columns. The genius of Imhotep was in fashioning these pillars of stone, carved in the forms of bundles of sticks bound together, and for the ceilings, stone carving that resembles rolls of reed matting, the usual building materials of the time. Let's see what this place looked like when it was first built and freshly painted. The complex contained courtyards, chapels, and sanctuaries built as a miniature reproduction of the city of Memphis, which has completely disappeared. These tourists are entering the wide courtyard used for the ritual of the Pharaoh's run during the Jubilee Festival. This is probably the world's oldest sports facility. On the 30th anniversary of his coronation, the pharaoh displayed his physical prowess by taking a long-distance run, a traditional rite in which he had to prove he was in condition to rule. Here is a reconstruction of the area. Around the complex of Xhosa, other pyramids were built and numerous mastabas like that of Ti. The mastaba of Ti is one of the largest and richest of the tombs of the Saqqara necropolis. It is a family tomb, where Ti's wife and his children are also buried. The burial chamber of Ti was situated beneath the roomy courtyard with its 12 columns, and can still be seen today. The upper chambers of the tomb are decorated with a fascinating cycle of tableaux that illustrate scenes from everyday life. Ti was an important functionary of state, the inspector of pyramids and solar temples of Abusir, as well as court hairdresser. This is a statue of the master of the house who lived with his family in the 5th dynasty of the pharaohs, 4,500 years ago. Let's move on now to the east bank of the Nile, opposite Saqqara, in search of Memphis, capital of the ancient kingdom. Where the road map is marked Mit Raina, that's the spot we're looking for. It's hard to imagine that this semi-abandoned place was once the heart of one of the most highly populated and cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world. Yet it was. Over 4,000 years ago, this was a bustling, thriving city with thousands of houses and temples lining the busy streets. Wealthy women carried on litters, merchants and functionaries of state, fishermen and artisans, slaves accompanying their masters and mistresses as they shopped for clothes, matting, vases, cosmetics, and every conceivable kind of merchandise. Memphis no longer exists. It has simply vanished, except for a few crumbling reminders of its existence. Over the centuries, her monuments have been dismantled and used to construct other places. In place of the vast metropolis, founded by Menes in 3100 BC, there is only barren desert, broken by the occasional date palm plantation. Of all its glories, there remains little to admire. The ruins of the Temple of Ptah, which must have been one of the largest in ancient Egypt, are almost entirely buried beneath the hillock on which Mit Rahina stands today. Why don't we take a look at Memphis the way it must have appeared at the height of its splendor thousands of years ago? This, of course, is an idealized view of it. Archaeological studies have not provided us with an exact plan of the place to guide us. In the distance, we can see one of the temples that must have enriched the city of Memphis. In front, we can see the wares of a mat seller on display. Woven from straw and papyrus reeds or linen fiber, they had a multitude of uses in the daily life of the Egyptians. But continuing our trip through ancient Memphis, let's visit a bakery. Bread was baked out in the courtyard of the baker's house, where it was also sold. We don't know their rules about bartering, but as the ancient Egyptians had no coins until 500 years before Christ, they must have used a system of exchange. Wages were apparently often paid in beans and onions. Now let's pick a house in Memphis and go inside to see how the people lived. Perhaps here was once the home of a scribe or a government official. It must have been the house of a rich man, as we can see from the opulence of this room, which was used for dining. As you can see, there were vases, jugs, and fine furniture that would not look out of place in a modern house. The Egyptians appreciated beautiful objects for daily use, especially personal ones, like the vases that contained kohl, a mascara they painted round their eyes, or bronze mirrors and combs. Cosmetics were widely used, and not only by the rich. Some even carried a cone of ointment on their heads, which melted in the heat of the day and trickled down into their hair, giving off a pleasant perfume. Laundries had to be very good at removing stale scent and makeup stains. As you can see in this wealthy scribe's home, everything is set for a banquet. There are mats to sit on and cushions, a table laid with various pieces of pottery. All that is missing is the host and hostess, the guests, and naturally the food and drink. In order to live to the perfect age of 110, it was considered necessary to eat the right things. The diet of the ancient Egyptians was actually widely varied and rich. They ate 3 meals a day and began with a light breakfast. This was followed at midday by another meal that was more of a snack. The principal meal of the day came in the evening. No one used cutlery, not even the royal family. The custom was to eat with one's fingers, but it was considered bad manners to use more than the 3 fingers of the right hand. As we have today, there was a great selection of breads. It was the basis of the diet. The dough was kneaded by hand or foot before being placed in the oven. However, bread was the cause of the spread of a problem very prevalent amongst the Egyptians: tooth decay. The grain used was ground on stone slabs, which left a certain amount of sand in the flour, so the bread was very gritty. This grit damaged their teeth, causing them to rot. In ancient Egypt, there were dentists, but the profession was combined with hairstyling. A great deal of onion, garlic, and cucumber was consumed, as well as root vegetables such as turnips and lettuce, which was thought to make men amorous and women fertile. Legumes were very popular: beans, peas, and lentils, which were exported in great quantities to other Mediterranean countries. Favorite fruits included figs, pomegranates, and dates. Beef, either grilled or roasted, was considered an excellent dish, but the Egyptians preferred the meat of fowl: duck, quail, pigeon, and goose. Even pelican was a bird often served at mealtimes. Strangely enough, chicken seems to be missing from the menu of the pharaohs and their subjects. Among the dishes displayed in a menu, we find the description of a filled bun. Perhaps the Earl of Sandwich didn't invent the sandwich after all. Here's the recipe. Remove the soft center from a bread roll. Sprinkle the crust with a mixture of vinegar and water. Mash the following ingredients in a mortar: pepper, honey, mint leaves, coriander, cheese, salt, and oil. Stuff the roll with the paste and serve cold. Meals were accompanied by wine, or more often beer, which had a high alcohol content. Wine was kept in sealed bottles with labels describing its origins and the year, which have proved to be some of the oldest written documents that have come down to us. The invention of writing, which seems to date from around 3000 BC, permitted the creation of the first form of efficient state bureaucracy. Little drawings were used, as we would use words or phrases based for the most part on a study of nature. These were called hieroglyphics. Thanks to this form of writing, the Egyptian people were able to develop a rich and varied literature containing history, mythology, informative and scientific works, as well as novels like The Story of Sinuhe, written over 4,000 years ago, which described the exploits and love life of an Egyptian doctor. The family was of fundamental importance in the Egypt of the pharaohs, and the institution of marriage respected. Affection was expressed by rubbing noses, as well as kissing. It was normal for women to marry men older than themselves. For couples unable to have children, orphans could be adopted, but a man whose partner was infertile could take a second wife if he so wished, in order to carry on the line. There is much evidence that the erotic life of the Egyptians was not confined to the family circle. Dancers and musicians performed at feasts, and the long wigs they wore were considered to be stimulating. At the end of a meal at the pharaoh's court, the king would sometimes retire with his concubines. This too was considered one of his duties, which is possibly why Ramses II had 162 children. When a man in love couldn't get anywhere with his beloved, he would resort to the occult. Magic was used to cure illnesses, ward off the evil eye, and invoke love in the cold of heart. In the Anastasi magic papyrus, a fragment of which is preserved in the British Museum, a magic potion is described to win the love of a woman. If you wish to make a woman pursue a man with mad passion, take the dried body of a shrew mouse, render it to dust, mix it with blood from your middle finger, straight from the heart, and place the mixture in a glass of wine. If you give this to a woman to drink, she will fall madly in love with you. Was it the wine that did the trick, or the powdered mouse? Whichever it was, it obviously worked. But then magic is, well, magic. Let's get back to the pharaohs and move to their city, Luxor. It stands on the right bank of the Nile, about 500 miles south of Cairo, filled with fascination and charm. The galley boats floating by on the calm waters of the river The colorful bazaar, the busy winding streets with carriages drawn by horses and vendors carrying their wares on their heads. Here there once stood the most powerful city in the world, Thebes. It replaced Memphis as capital of Egypt after the Theban princes put down Hyksos and his invading army. Homer described it as the city of 100 entrances. Only the grains of the desert sand could be counted more than the riches her over 500,000 inhabitants had tucked away. Unlike Memphis, Thebes has not disappeared. Everywhere you look, you can see, hidden between modern apartment blocks, temples, sphinx-lined avenues, and other imposing ruins, remnants of its glorious past. Her central position on the course of the Nile, an ideal point of balance between Upper and Lower Egypt, made her the perfect capital city and contributed to her enormous power and prosperity. The real city, Thebes of the living, with its temples of Luxor and Karnak, dedicated to the divine triad, lay on the right bank where the sun rises. The left bank, where the sun goes down, was where Thebes of the dead lay, a city entirely dedicated to the deceased. But let's take a look at Luxor, which grew up around the great temple dedicated to the god Ammon. The archaeological excavations of the temple began in the last century with the demolition of hundreds of houses that had been built on top of it. The work has remained unfinished because a 14th century mosque still occupies part of the first courtyard and cannot be dismantled, as it too is a historical as well as a religious monument. The temple measures 880 feet in length, running parallel to the river, and is 180 feet wide. It was used only once a year for the procession to celebrate Ammon. The statue of the god was carried from Karnak to Luxor in a boat along the canals connected to the Nile. It was regarded as the god's regular outing to visit the southern part of his domain. The populace followed the procession from far off, watching from the river's banks, as they were not permitted to take part in the procession or to enter the temples. An obelisk 90 feet in height stood outside the entrance to the temple. Originally there were two, but one of them was taken to France and now graces the Place de la Concorde in Paris. Colossal statues of Ramses II, who had the temple enlarged and a monumental gateway built, stand on either side. The face of Amenhotep III smiles benignly on visitors today, just as it did in his own time. Let's see how the pylon looked in 1200 BC, seen from the Sphinx-lined avenue. The pylon is decorated with epic scenes of the glorious victory of Ramses II at Qadesh in Syria over the Hittites in 1285 BC. Ramses the Great was not only a prodigious builder and fearless warrior, but in the 66 years of his reign, he fathered 162 offspring, had 8 official wives, and a harem of 100 concubines. Now we go back to the Temple of Luxor. At the northwest corner of the first courtyard stands the Mosque of Abu el-Hagag, considered a particularly holy place by followers of Islam. It contributes an even more fascinating aspect to the wide area, where you can admire statues of Amenophis III and Ramses II between the columns. These columns, like those in all of ancient Egypt, were colored in much the same way that you can see them here. This is more or less what this courtyard looked like over 3,000 years ago. Of course, long before the mosque was added. Moving between the statues of these two pharaohs, you come into a 55-yard-long colonnade, formed by 7 couples of pillars over 50 feet tall, with papyrus capitals. These workmen are scraping off the salt crystals that have formed on the surface of the stone and are corroding it. From here, you can reach the oldest part of the temple, built by Amenophis III, who was probably the vainest of all the pharaohs. He had himself portrayed more than any other ruler, and well over 1,000 portraits of him have survived to this day. Ramses II didn't hesitate to erase his name and substitute his own. Two miles divide Luxor from Karnak, where the colossal complex of monuments dedicated to the divine triad of Amon, Montu, and Mut stands. 10 pylons, enormous encircling walls, and hundreds of columns laid out over a surface area more than 4,000 feet by 1,900 feet make this the largest temple ever to have been built. Its construction took 2,000 years, and its structure contains a pylon belonging to one pharaoh, a series of columns to another, a wall to another, and so on. So for caprice, jealousy, pride, or envy, the pharaohs transformed and amplified this place over and over again to placate their god Amon and his priests. They created increasingly larger temples, more and more numerous columns, bigger and bigger statues, and higher obelisks to ensure their place in eternity. How quiet it is. The statues stand, sit, and kneel with an infinite sense of patience, waiting to be admired, photographed, and studied, their lips sealed, unwilling to divulge secret details of the past no one will ever know. Let's begin our visit to the Temple of Karnak, dedicated to the god Amon, by following the tourists with their ever-ready cameras. Today, the entrance is on the north side, through an avenue of sphinxes with ram's heads. The ram was sacred to Amon. In the time of the pharaohs, this was a stone bridge which crossed a canal connected to the Nile that brought merchant vessels loaded with goods. The entrance to the temple was through this pylon, which remained partly unfinished. It was built by Nectanebos I, the last Egyptian-born pharaoh, who belonged to the 30th and final dynasty. Let's see what this area looked like when the wall of the embankment was washed by the waters of the Nile. No boats can be seen here now, but it once must have been crowded with them. If you think that roughly 1,200 years before Christ, 80,000 people were employed here, counting priests, guards, servants, and farmers. The widest courtyard of all those known in the Egyptian temples is laid out beyond the pylon. It is 300 feet wide and 265 feet long. Of the 10 columns that originally formed the cloister, only one remains, in the center of the courtyard, constructed by the pharaoh Taharqa around 670 BC. The sacred boat that carried the symbol of the sun god from Karnak to Luxor in the solemn ritual processions was normally kept here. The public was not permitted to go beyond this point. Only the pharaoh himself and his priests could enter the most sacred part of the temple. Let's see the way it probably looked in the 6th century BC. The cloister was supported by 10 columns 65 feet in height. There was probably a roof of matting covering the area. The sacred boat, containing the effigy of the god, stood in the middle on an alabaster base, which was itself as tall as a grown man. Make no mistake about the proportions of this place. It's enormous. When you've passed the first pylon, you will find yourself inside one of the largest works of art the Egyptians have left us, the great hypostyle hall, 375 feet wide and 165 feet deep, with 134 columns. The 12 columns of the central nave are taller, with their papyrus capitals open and enormous architraves that take the ceiling up to 75 feet. The circumference of the capitals at their widest point is 48 feet. The 122 side columns have closed papyrus capitals and are shorter. Grilled windows supplying the light must have created a stupendous effect. The scenes that decorate the walls of the salon depict ceremonial processions and coronations. Here you can see Ramses II paying homage to the Theban gods. The boat is carried by the powerful priests of Ammon, dressed as mythological figures. They had 2 baths a day and 2 at night, and took a vow of chastity. They were completely shaven without a hair on their bodies, and were dressed in robes of bleached linen. It was a tough life, but well worthwhile. The social caste of priests in Egypt boasted great wealth and influence. It was their job to supervise the prayers and offerings made to the gods. This was not so simple, as a complicated array of divinities presided over the Egyptians, a surprising number of them, with human bodies and the heads of animals. They possessed many of man's qualities, but also some of his defects. Sekhmet, for example, had a cruel streak and enjoyed getting drunk. Let's take a closer look at some of these gods. This is Ammon, which means the hidden one, head of the whole pantheon of Egyptian divinities. Mut, Ammon's wife, who often materialized in the form of the pharaoh's bride. Montu, originally the falcon god, god of war, who protected the pharaoh in time of war. Anubis, with his jackal's head, was the god of embalming. Sekhmet is portrayed as a lioness. Her name means the mighty. Ptah, god of Memphis, protector of sculptors, smithies, and builders. Tot, represented with the head of an ibis, was the god of wisdom, inventor of the hieroglyphics. Now let's return to Karnak. Walking the length of the central part of the temple, we reach the most sacred place, the chamber of granite, where the boat was kept. This is one of the obelisks erected by Queen Hatshepsut, almost 100 feet high, making it one of the tallest in all Egypt. On Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III, who loathed her, had a wall built around the obelisk to hide any reminder of the dead queen. This is Thutmose III's feasting hall, which much later was used as a Christian church. The faded faces of saints can still be seen painted on the columns. In the great temple, there were several spaces called sun halls. One of these is the botanical garden. It was given this name because it is decorated with exotic plants and animals, giving us some idea of the importance the pharaohs gave to agriculture in general and gardens in particular. Everything was painted in bright colors. Our visit ends at the great sacred lake, where the priests of Ammon, Ra, purified themselves in the holy waters that flowed from the Nile. The giant granite scarab beetle, dedicated to Amenophis III, is now one of the favorite places for tourists. As superstition has it, to walk around it brings good luck. This ritual seems to be especially popular with tourists from Japan. Now let's cross the Nile to reach the left bank. This is the west bank, where the sun sets and life's flame, too, is extinguished. This is Thebes of the dead, where over the centuries thousands of tombs and temples have been built. One of the most impressive temples here is undoubtedly that of Queen Hatshepsut, which sits at the bottom of a 900-foot cliff. In ancient times, this area wasn't as arid and bare as it is today. There were small lakes all around here, woods and gardens. Hatshepsut was a very unusual person, since she married her half-brother, Thutmose II, and wore a ceremonial beard at her coronation. At one side rose the much older temple of Mentuhotep, a king of the 11th dynasty, which we can now see as it originally looked. We continue our journey along the left bank of the Nile to Medinet Habu. For many years, there was just a pile of rubble here used as a source of building materials. A small village grew up among the ruins during the Christian era, preserving at least a part of the temple fortress erected by Ramses III, the warrior pharaoh of the 20th dynasty. The pylon at the entrance of the temple is richly decorated with military scenes of the pharaoh. A rough estimate of the number of prisoners taken in battle can be made by a glance at the amount of hands and other amputated human organs piled together. The original colors have completely vanished, but thanks to modern technology, we can reproduce them. Here is Ramses III, the pharaoh who fought and won many wars during the 30 years of his reign. Like most of us, he is improved by a healthy tan. These are the people from the sea whom he vanquished, a group of united people from numerous allied countries who, before attacking Egypt, had defeated the Hittite Empire. This is an Amorrheo from what is now Lebanon. And this is a Shekelesh from Sicily, instantly recognizable by his typical cloth cap. Now let's return to Medinet Habu to visit a royal palace that stood beside the temple. It was not only a palace, it was a home, although it appears that Ramses III never even slept here. A pity, because there's a bedroom, a bathroom, and even a shower. Now we'll go to another part of the west bank of the Nile, where once there stood the great temple of Amenophis III. These statues, known as the Colossi of Memnon, are all that remain of this temple that once stood over 70 feet in height. In the year 27 BC, an earthquake opened a long crack in the Colossus on the north side. At dawn, when the stone began to dry out after the dampness of night, the rising air made a sound like a melancholy lament. The lament of the Colossus attracted a lot of early morning visitors, mostly Greeks and Romans, who left their marks upon the stone. Even the Emperor Hadrian was guilty of a little graffiti in 130 AD, together with his wife and courtiers. In the 3rd century AD, the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus ordered the monument to be restored. It has never been heard to lament since. West of Thebes lies the place where the pharaohs decided to project their images into eternity. Ironically, most of them are forgotten, and the pharaoh who achieved the greatest and most lasting fame was a mere boy of 18 who died after a very short reign, Tutankhamun. His reputation rested on the discovery of his tomb in 1922 in the Valley of the Kings by the English archaeologist Howard Carter. It remains unique in the annals of archaeology, the only time a perfect tomb was found still filled with incredible treasures. The young pharaoh's body was hidden in a complicated series of mummy cases of gold, inlaid with precious stones. Around him were no less than 5,000 objects of enormous historical as well as monetary value. A golden chariot, beds, chairs, stools, and statuettes, all covered in gold. Lamps with alabaster bases, weapons, sandals, and the statue of a faithful servant. A multitude of incredibly beautiful things that can be seen today in perfect condition in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. On the 11th of November 1925, Carter opened the last of the many sarcophagi that contained the pharaoh's body. He discovered Tutankhamun's mummy. The eyes were open, and the lashes long and perfectly intact, the nose narrow and slightly bent. On his face was a funeral mask of incredible beauty in gold, lapis lazuli, and turquoise. But what was Tutankhamun's real face like? Probably like this, according to a reconstruction made in Dorchester, England. Many tombs of the pharaohs carried warning signs. Anyone who violates my resting place will be hounded to death and beyond. Whatever you might think of Tutankhamun, this is surely not the face of a vengeful monarch who'd put a curse like that on anyone. Yet, the discovery of his tomb was followed by an unsettling series of unexplained accidents, disease, and sudden death. A cholera epidemic broke out in Luxor soon after. Then nearly a dozen of Carter's friends and acquaintances committed suicide or died in mysterious circumstances after visiting the tomb, including Lord Carnarvon, Carter's patron, who was bitten on the left cheek by a mosquito, contracted blood poisoning, and soon died. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the curse of Tutankhamun needs a lot of explaining, so we had better move on. After so much mystery, our journey brings us to the port of Aswan, on Egypt's border. We are now 600 miles south of Cairo, almost at the end of the Nile Valley. Ivory, ebony, pink and blue. These are the colors of Aswan. In the opinion of many, the most beautiful of all the Egyptian cities along the Nile. The superb position of Aswan with its gentle winters was well known even in the time of the pharaohs, and scribes frequently eulogized about its temples and gardens. This has always been a place of trade with Nubia, mythical land of gold mines, ivory, tropical wood, which bordered pharaonic Egypt. Historically, this has always been the border of Egypt. The name Aswan is a derivation of the old word swen, meaning trade. Strangely enough today, probably the same as always, trade is carried on mostly at night, perhaps to avoid the day's relentless heat. Now, as then, you can buy the spices here that made this market famous. Not far away from here is the island of Philae, with its harmonious temple. Here is the sacred island, with its temple dedicated to Isis, the pearl of Egypt, loved by artists and painters of all ages, which houses a complex of incredibly beautiful monuments. The whole complex risked being submerged under the lake formed by the Nasser Dam, but in 1968, UNESCO launched a campaign to save the temple with an international competition. The contract for this vast undertaking was won by the Italian engineering company Condotte Mazzi Estero, which was entrusted with the task of dismantling the entire complex and rebuilding it on an island, roughly 200 yards downriver from the original site. The Temple of Isis was erected exactly as it had been built by Ptolemy in the first half of the 3rd century BC. The divinities to whom it was dedicated were also worshipped by the Romans, as we can see from this elegant pavilion added in the time of the Emperor Trajan. During the era of the Roman Empire, the Egyptian gods were vastly popular and worshipped in Rome and all her provinces. The time has come to end our voyage along the Nile because we've reached our destination, Abu Simbel, an extraordinary, breathtaking example of the Egypt of the pharaohs. Abu Simbel, 190 miles from Aswan, is still today a borderland where the desert reaches out to meet the waters of Lake Nasser. Further south once lay neighboring Nubia, which is now Sudan, Black Africa. Here, Ramses II, in the 24th year of his reign, 1255 BC, ordered 2 gigantic temples to be constructed to celebrate his victory over the Hittites. The larger of them, dedicated to Ammon and the sun god Ra, has a huge facade cut into the rock with 4 enormous statues of Ramses, at least 65 feet high, surrounded by minor characters. Once through the Guardian's door, you'll find yourself inside the temple in a huge hall with more statues of Ramses II, 10 feet high, in the role of the god Osiris. Along the walls are scenes of Ramses looking godlike in the midst of various battles. The whole temple is a homage to the sun god. At dawn, the first rays of the sun coming through the doorway illuminate the statues of Ra, Ammon, and Fat, as well as Ramses, of course, seated at the far end of the hall, almost 200 feet inside the rock. This is how the draftsman David Roberts saw it in 1838, when the temple was still partially buried in desert sand. The smaller temple is dedicated to Queen Nefertari and the goddess Hathor, and has 6 statues alternating between Ramses and the Queen. Around the statues, an inscription tells us, "Ramses, who built the temple, dug from the pure mountain of Nubia of fine white stone for his splendid bride, Nefertari, the beautiful of face. Never before has such a thing as this been made." These monuments, too, like those of Philae, were threatened by the waters of the Aswan Dam and had to be dismantled and moved to higher ground, a monumental task in itself, even for modern construction crews. Let's see what the great temple was like in the time of Ramses, when the statues were not the color of sand, but looked like this. After Abu Simbel, our journey brings us to the capital of modern Egypt, Cairo. Anyone who has never seen Cairo, says a character in the Arabian Nights, has not seen the world. Her earth is of gold, her Nile a wonder, her women are like virgins with black eyes from paradise. Her houses are palaces. Her air is sweet with perfume, like the wood of the aloe, and raises the spirits. How could it be otherwise, since Cairo is the mother of the world? More than 500 years have passed since this tale described Cairo thus. Now, alas, the mother of the world looks more like its great-grandmother in dire need of a facelift. However, this said, Cairo remains one of the most fascinating cities of the Middle East. The children smile in gentle curiosity. Its women are still beautiful, but its perfumed air now contains a lethal amount of pollution, thanks largely to the appallingly chaotic traffic situation. It has become a modern metropolis with 14 million inhabitants, the largest population of any city on the African continent. Between the elevated highways and high-rise buildings, it's still possible to see ancient buildings, which seem to have been constructed from materials taken from the pyramids. This is particularly true of the splendid palace of Sultan Hassan, a kind of university college, built between 1356 and 1362. It is one of the largest and most perfect examples of Islamic architecture, a monument of exquisite proportions, an inspiration of strength and dignity, perhaps partly due to the perfection of the stones from the pyramids. Cairo was never one of the capital cities of the pharaohs. During their various dynasties, there was a settlement here called Kere Aha, which meant place of battle, because according to the legend, this was the spot where the gods Seth and Horus had a significant confrontation. Around 500 BC, it became an important trading center. To find out about that period, we must visit the Coptic quarter of the city. It is one of the oldest and most interesting parts of Cairo, where the most beautiful churches can be found, like the one where the Holy Family lived for a spell while they were in Egypt during the infancy of Jesus. The quarter is still home to the city's Orthodox Christians today. In the 2nd century AD, the Romans built a fort here to defend a navigable canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea. 2 massive towers protected the waterway. The one on the south side has been partially restored, while the other is incorporated into the structure of St. George's Church. Let's see what this area must have looked like 100 years after Christ's birth, with the 2 so-called Trajan towers intact and the canal. It was wide enough for 2 large ships to pass one another without scraping sides, and it made it possible to journey to the sea at any time of the year without having to submit to the hardships of the long and uncomfortable desert route. In our journey through ancient Egypt, we have not overlooked Alexandria, the city that was founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, the last capital of ancient Egypt, where the last ruling descendant of the pharaohs, Cleopatra, lived and died. Today, Alexandria is Egypt's 2nd most important city with a population of 6 million. A delightful place, its position overlooking the Mediterranean making it a popular summer vacation spot, despite the turbulence of its traffic, which can sometimes make your head spin. 3 centuries before the birth of Jesus, it possessed a famous library, a museum, and a lighthouse that was numbered among the 7 wonders of the world. It was first demonstrated here that the world was round. Geometry was invented, and the Old Testament translated into Greek. Anyone seeking signs of its ancient past will be disappointed. Now most of it is buried beneath the modern city. What little remains of the Great Lighthouse, which was built in 279 BC, is incorporated into a fortress down at the port. It was more or less demolished by many earthquakes over the centuries, until at last the Sultan Qaitbay used most of the remaining building materials to construct the fort in 1480 AD, itself a splendid example of military architecture. Some granite columns from the lighthouse can still be seen by the gateway in the central tower and in the ramparts that descend into the sea. Let's take a look at the great lighthouse as it was 2 centuries before Christ. It was almost 400 feet high, the tallest building in the ancient world. A contemporary writer tells us its beam could be seen 34 miles out to sea, the light provided by a huge fire magnified by giant polished metal reflectors, probably made of bronze, like most mirrors of that time. How such a fire could be so bright remains a mystery, not so much for the type of fuel used, wood or animal dung perhaps, but for its luminosity. With a little imagination, we could see Queen Cleopatra at one of its windows. She played out one of the most tragic love stories of all time here in Alexandria. Cleopatra was the last sovereign to carry the title ruler of 2 lands. Apparently she was not the great beauty she is often portrayed as. She was short, not more than 5'1" or 2", and had a rather large nose. But there is no doubt that she was a very fascinating woman, astute, volatile, and politically ambitious. She came to the throne in BC 51 at the age of 18, and when her younger brother Ptolemy raised an army to overthrow her, she turned for help to the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar, who was visiting her in Alexandria. He defended her and secured her position as ruler of Egypt, but his interest in her was more than official. Not long after that, she gave birth to a son she called Caesarion, because he was the only child of Julius Caesar. However, the story of Cleopatra doesn't end there. 5 years later, another Roman general arrived in Alexandria, Mark Antony, with orders to force the Egyptian queen to submit to the domination of Rome. But he fell in love with her and found himself defending her against his own country. This caused a great scandal and furore in Rome, and the general Octavian sent an army to subdue him in a bloody war which lasted 3 years. Defeat and humiliation were too much for Mark Antony, who committed suicide when Alexandria was occupied by the Roman force. Cleopatra killed herself with a deliberate snake bite, clutching the poisonous asp to her breast. With the death of Cleopatra, the 3,000-year reign of the pharaohs came to an end, and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Lively and intelligent, sophisticated and ingenious, passionate, powerful, and yet spiritual, the people of ancient Egypt created a society that lasted 3,000 years, longer than any other civilization, actually longer than all the other major civilizations put together. Gift of the Nile, Egypt was also the fruit of man's wonderful ability to grow and develop, pushing ahead with invention, drive, and creativity, seeking to make the world a better place. But there is still a lot to learn about and from Egypt. As each millennium passes, Egypt reveals more of its life, times, and wonders. Perhaps the key to the future lies in the unending wealth of knowledge still to be found in antiquity.